The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the heavy, suffocating kind that wraps around you, making every breath feel like a disturbance. The judge sat still, her hands folded in front of her. The jury leaned forward just slightly, their eyes fixed on the small boy standing in the center of the room. The air felt thick, charged with something invisible but undeniable. Ben's tiny fingers curled into fists at his sides. He was only 9 years old, but in that moment, he felt much older. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears, but he didn't let his fear show. Not now. Not after everything. His wide eyes locked onto the tall man in front of him, Callahan, the one who had turned his family's life into a nightmare. "Say it again," the lawyer urged, his voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. "Tell the court exactly what you saw." Ben swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His mother sat at the edge of her seat, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. He could feel her fear, her silent plea, but he also knew that this was his moment. The truth sat on the edge of his tongue, waiting to be set free. He took a shaky breath, straightened his shoulders, and spoke. His voice, small but firm, cut through the silence like a blade. "I saw everything," he said, "and I know the truth." A murmur spread through the courtroom, whispers rippling like waves in a storm. The judge adjusted her glasses. The opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Callahan, who had been so confident just moments ago, suddenly looked pale. Ben turned his head slightly, his eyes flickering toward his mother. She wasn't just scared. She looked like she was holding on to the last shred of hope. Hope that he wouldn't be silenced. Hope that someone, anyone, would believe him. The lawyer leaned in closer. "Are you sure?" Ben met his gaze, steady now. He nodded. "Yes." And then, with the kind of bravery that no one expected from a boy his age, he spoke the words that would change everything. The room didn't just go silent. It froze, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just been said. The judge exhaled slowly. The jury exchanged glances. The man on the witness stand, the one who had been smiling just moments ago, looked like he wanted to disappear. But Ben wasn't done, because this story didn't start here. It started 3 months ago, before the courtroom, before the whispers, before his world began to fall apart. 3 months earlier, the house was different. It wasn't the kind of home filled with warmth and laughter, but it was still home, or at least, it used to be. Ben had always been a quiet kid, the kind who noticed things that others didn't. He heard things too, whispers in the night when his parents thought he was asleep, the kind of whispers that carried weight, that made his mother's voice shake and his father's responses come in sharp, hushed tones. At first, the arguments were short, soft but sharp, like knives gliding just beneath the surface of normal conversations. Then they became louder, more urgent. His father's voice was strained, frustrated. His mother's was tight with something that sounded a lot like fear. Ben didn't understand everything they said, but he caught bits and pieces, words like danger, debt, a mistake too big to fix. And then one night, as he lay curled under his blanket, staring at the ceiling, he heard his father whisper something that made his stomach twist into knots. "They'll come looking, Lisa. If I stay, they'll come for all of us." And then, just like that, his father was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty chair at the kitchen table, an untouched coffee mug in the sink, and a silence that stretched for days. His mother told him and Emma that everything was fine, that they didn't have to worry. But Ben knew better. The way she locked the doors twice before going to bed, the way her eyes flicked toward the window every time a car passed by, it all told a different story. Then, one evening, the unease in the air thickened. Ben noticed him first, a man in a suit. He stood across the street, too still, too watchful. His sharp eyes never blinked, never wavered, as if he was waiting for something. Or someone. At first, Ben thought he was imagining it, but the man kept coming back. Some days, he was across the street, standing next to a black car. Other days, Ben saw him outside his mother's workplace. And sometimes, late at night, he'd spot a dark silhouette near their porch, disappearing before he could say anything. His mother noticed, too. He could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she always looked over her shoulder. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Ben was playing outside with Emma when the black car pulled up in front of their house. The door opened, and the man stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached the porch where his mother sat. Ben felt something cold crawl up his spine. He grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her back behind him. His mother stood up as the man stopped in front of her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, but laced with something unsettling. "Not in front of my children," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. The man ignored her. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, holding it out like it was something ordinary. "Your husband made a deal," he said, "and now you're going to pay for it." Ben saw his mother's hands shake as she took the folder, her fingers hesitating before she opened it. Whatever she saw inside made her breath hitch, her face draining of color. "No," she gasped, barely more than a whisper. "This isn't true." The man took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You have until the end of the month." And just like that, he turned and walked away. The car door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Ben watched as the black car disappeared down the street, but his mother never moved. She just stood there staring at the papers in her hands, her face frozen in fear. The knock at the door came early in the morning, too early, the kind of knock that wasn't polite, wasn't patient. It was sharp, firm, demanding. Ben sat up in bed, his heart already pounding. His mother had barely slept the night before. He knew because he had heard her pacing, whispering into the phone, her voice low and strained. Down the hall, he heard Emma stir. Then, another knock, louder this time. Lisa hesitated before opening the door, and the moment she did, Ben felt the air shift. 2 police officers stood on their porch, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, spoke first. "Lisa Thompson?" His mother's grip on the doorknob tightened. "Yes?" "We need you to come with us," the officer said. Lisa frowned. "Why? What's this about?" The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "There's been a complaint filed against you." Ben, standing barefoot in the hallway, felt the world tilt. "What?" Lisa breathed. "By who?" The officers didn't answer. Ben's feet moved before he could think. He ran to his mother's side, grabbing her arm. "No, she didn't do anything." The officers barely looked at him. "Please, ma'am, we just need you to come with us," the first officer said, though there was nothing reassuring about his tone. Lisa turned to Ben and Emma. For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes, something that looked a lot like regret. She reached out, brushing Ben's hair back, squeezing Emma's tiny hands. "I'll be back soon," she whispered, but Ben knew she was lying. The officers stepped inside. One of them pulled out handcuffs. "No!" Ben shouted, pushing against them. "You can't take her! She didn't do anything wrong!" His voice cracked, but they ignored him. Emma, still in her pajamas, let out a small, frightened sob, clutching Ben's arm. "Mommy?" Lisa turned sharply. "Don't be scared, baby. Everything's fine." But it wasn't. They cuffed her hands behind her back like she was a criminal, like she was dangerous. Ben's chest burned. "You can't do this. My mom isn't a bad person." The female officer sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder, trying to pull him back. "Kid, we're just doing our job." Her voice was softer than the others, but it didn't matter, because they were taking his mother away. Lisa gave them one last look, her expression unreadable, before they guided her down the steps. The police car was waiting. Emma was crying now, gripping Ben's shirt with tiny, shaking fingers. "She's coming back, right?" she whispered. Ben didn't know how to answer. The front door stood wide open. Cold air rushed inside, and that's when he saw it. Across the street, leaning against the black car, watching it all unfold, was the man in the suit, Callahan. His expression was unreadable, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. But Ben knew. He knew that this wasn't just bad luck. This was planned, and it wasn't over. Ben sat on the front steps of their house, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The police car was gone. His mother was gone. And across the street, Callahan's black car had disappeared too, but Ben knew. He wasn't gone. Not really. Emma was inside, curled up on the couch, still sniffling. She had fallen asleep with tear-streaked cheeks, hugging her stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping her safe. But there was no safety anymore. No one was going to help them. Unless he did something. Ben wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, took a deep breath, and stood up. He had to find the truth. He had to save his mom. There was only one place to start. The walk to the police station was longer than he remembered. His legs felt heavy, his stomach twisted with nerves. By the time he reached the front desk, he could barely breathe. A woman with dark curls and tired eyes glanced up from her computer. "Hey there, buddy. You lost?" Ben shook his head. "Number my mom, Lisa Thompson. The police took her, but she didn't do anything." The woman hesitated, giving him a careful look. "Sweetheart, if the police arrested her, there must have been a reason." "There was a reason," Ben insisted, his voice firm. "But it wasn't real. Someone made them do it. A man in a suit. He's been following us. He gave her papers, and then the next day the police came." The woman's expression softened, but not in the way he wanted. It was the kind of look adults gave kids when they didn't believe them. "Maybe you should go home, kid. Let the grown-ups—" "My dad," Ben blurted out. The woman froze. "My dad's name was David Thompson." He swallowed hard. "And I think he was running from something. I think that man in the suit had something to do with it." That was when everything changed. The woman's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She glanced toward a door at the back of the station, then picked up the phone. A few minutes later, a tall officer with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression walked in. He knelt down so he was eye level with Ben. "Hey, kid. My name's Officer Daniels. Why don't you tell me everything you know?" So Ben did. He told him about his dad's sudden disappearance, about the black car, about the man in the suit who always seemed to be there, watching, waiting. When he finished, Daniel's face was unreadable. He sat back on his heels, rubbing his chin, as if something about the story unsettled him. "Can you describe this man?" Ben nodded. "Tall, wears a suit. His eyes, they're weird, like they don't blink a lot." Daniels exchanged a glance with another officer. Then, he stood up. "Stay right here, okay? I need to check on something." Ben watched as he disappeared into the back room. His stomach churned. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Minutes passed. And then, the front doors swung open. Ben's breath caught. The man in the suit stepped inside. Callahan. His black shoes barely made a sound as he crossed the floor. But Ben couldn't hear anything else, just the rush of blood in his ears. Callahan smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I heard a little boy was making some wild accusations," he said smoothly. "I thought I'd come clear things up." His sharp gaze settled on Ben. "You shouldn't tell stories, son." Ben's pulse pounded in his ears as Callahan's eyes locked onto him. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The officers at the station barely reacted to his presence, which meant only one thing: he wasn't just some stranger to them. He belonged here. Callahan took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "It's not a good habit, you know. Lying." Ben's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not lying." The man exhaled a quiet chuckle. "You're a smart kid, but smart kids learn when to keep quiet." He leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only Ben could hear. "You keep asking questions, and people you care about might start disappearing, just like your father." A sharp chill ran down Ben's spine. He wanted to yell, to tell the officers standing around that this was the man they should be arresting, but he could see it in their faces, the hesitation, the quiet discomfort. Callahan had power here. He gave Ben one last long look before turning to Officer Daniels. "It seems we have a bit of a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "I'd like to clear things up." Daniels' jaw tightened, but after a pause he nodded. "Step into my office." Callahan glanced back at Ben. "You run along home now, son." But Ben didn't move. He couldn't move. Something about this wasn't right. As Callahan disappeared into the office with Daniels, Ben's mind raced. There was no way he was letting this man talk his way out of whatever trouble was coming. He needed to know what was being said. Heart hammering, he scanned the station. A hallway stretched along the side, leading toward the back rooms. The office door was solid wood, but there was a vent, small, just above the baseboard. If he could get close enough? Ben didn't hesitate. He ducked low and crept down the hallway, pressing himself against the wall just beside the vent. Then he listened. "Kid's been running his mouth," Callahan was saying, his voice smooth and unwavering. "It'd be a real shame if this got messy. We wouldn't want that, would we?" Daniels didn't answer right away. Then his voice came, lower, sharper. "You think threats are going to work on me?" A soft chuckle. "Officer, I think you misunderstand. This is just business." Silence. Then Daniels again, more cautious this time. "Lisa Thompson, the arrest. That was you, wasn't it?" Ben's breath hitched. Another pause. Then Callahan's voice, softer now, almost amused. "You always were good at putting the pieces together. I'll give you that." That was enough. Ben turned to slip away, and his foot scraped against the tile. The conversation in the office stopped. Ben's blood ran cold. A chair scraped back. Footsteps. Ben darted down the hallway, his heart slamming against his ribs. He rounded the corner, nearly knocking over a desk as he searched for a hiding spot. There. An empty storage closet. He yanked open the door, slipped inside, and barely managed to pull it shut before heavy footsteps entered the hall. A shadow passed beneath the door. A long, terrifying silence. Then, "Must have been nothing," someone muttered. The footsteps faded. Ben stayed frozen for several seconds before slowly exhaling. That was close. Too close. But now he knew. Callahan had set up his mother, and Officer Daniels knew it too. But if the police couldn't, or wouldn't, stop him, then Ben needed another plan. He needed to go somewhere Callahan didn't expect. Somewhere his father might have left answers, and he knew exactly where to start. His dad's old office. Ben slipped out of the station and into the cold evening air. The streets were quiet as he made his way across town. He'd only been to his father's office once, back when things were normal. It was in a small brick building above a bakery, the kind of place that most people didn't look twice at. Now it looked abandoned. The windows were dark, the door locked. Ben's gut told him there was something inside, something his dad had left behind, and he was going to find it. The office smelled like dust and something stale, like papers that hadn't been touched in years. The door had been locked, but the side window was loose, easy enough for someone small like Ben to squeeze through. Inside, the space felt frozen in time. Papers were still stacked on the desk. A coffee mug sat untouched, now coated with a fine layer of dust. It was as if his father had just stepped out and never returned. Ben's fingers hovered over the papers, flipping through receipts and notes that didn't make much sense. He didn't know what he was looking for, just something. Something that could tell him why his dad had run. And then, in the bottom drawer, he found it. A key. It was small, plain-looking, but had the numbers 17RR etched onto it. Ben's stomach flipped. River Road. He knew that place. It was a storage facility just outside of town. His dad had taken him there once, years ago, when they needed to store some old furniture. If this key belonged to his dad, then whatever was in that storage unit had been hidden for a reason. Ben didn't waste a second. He tucked the key into his pocket and slipped back out the window, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward the edge of town. The streets were quiet, but every shadow felt like a pair of eyes watching him. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the black car, expecting to hear Callahan's smooth voice behind him. But no one followed. Not yet. By the time he reached the storage facility, the sun had sunk low and the air had turned cold. The chain-link fence rattled in the wind as he pushed open the rusted gate. Rows of metal doors stretched in both directions, each one padlocked shut. Unit 17RR was near the back. Ben's fingers trembled as he slid the key into the lock. Click. The padlock popped open. He hesitated only for a second before yanking the heavy door up. The inside was small and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Boxes lined the walls, stacked carelessly, covered in dust. Ben stepped inside, his breath quickening. He opened the first box. Old papers, receipts, nothing useful. The second, clothes. His frustration grew. What am I even looking for? Then, his eyes landed on something in the corner. A wooden box. Unlike the others, this one was locked with a small latch. It wasn't meant to be opened easily. Ben reached out, pried at the edges, and after a few tugs, snap. The latch broke. The lid creaked open. And inside, a gun. Ben's breath caught in his throat. His father had never owned a gun. Not that he knew of. His fingers moved past it, grabbing the stack of papers underneath. Bank statements, documents, a contract with Callahan's name printed in bold letters. Ben's stomach twisted. His dad had been involved with Callahan. But how? And then he saw it. A photo. It was old, slightly faded, showing his father standing beside a man Ben didn't recognize. On the back, scrawled in rushed handwriting, were the words, "If anything happens to me, give this to the police." Ben's hands shook. His father knew something was coming. He had tried to leave a trail, but before Ben could think any further, a sound, an engine. His chest tightened. A car, and not just any car, the black one. Ben's heart pounded as he peeked through the narrow opening in the storage unit. Callahan's men were here. They had found him. Ben's breath hitched as the black car rolled to a stop just outside the storage facility. The headlights cut through the dimly lit alley, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He had seconds, maybe less. He shoved the papers into his backpack, his fingers shaking as he zipped it up. His eyes darted around the storage unit, searching for a way out. The door was too obvious. If he ran, they'd see him. Then he spotted it, an air vent near the floor. Without hesitating, he dropped to his stomach and wiggled toward it. The metal cover was loose. With one quick tug, it popped free, and Ben barely managed to squeeze inside just as the storage unit door rattled violently. A voice, cold and sharp. "Open it!" The storage door rolled up with a metallic groan. Ben pressed himself deeper into the vent, holding his breath. Through the narrow slats, he saw 2 pairs of polished shoes step inside. One of them belonged to Callahan. The other, someone Ben hadn't seen before. A tall man with a deep scar running down his cheek. Callahan took slow, deliberate steps into the unit, scanning the boxes. He let out a quiet sigh. "I know you're here, kid." His voice was almost amused. "You found something, didn't you?" Ben stayed frozen. Scarface crouched near the wooden box, flipping through the remaining papers. His lips curled into a sneer. The brat got them. Callahan's face darkened. He turned toward the door, hands sliding into his pockets. I'm done playing games. Find him. Scarface cracked his knuckles. And if we do? Callahan exhaled slowly. Make sure he doesn't talk. Ben's stomach dropped. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were going to kill him. The moment they turned away, he started crawling. The vent was tight, barely enough space to move, but he pushed forward, ignoring the dust clogging his nose. He had to get out, had to run. Behind him, footsteps echoed through the storage unit. A crash, boxes thrown aside. A frustrated growl. He's not here. Ben's heart pounded. They'd realize where he was any second now, and if they found the vent, he reached the end. A loose grate. With one final push, he kicked it open and tumbled into the alley behind the storage units. The cold night air hit him like a slap. No time to think. He ran. His sneakers slapped against the pavement as he darted between buildings, weaving through narrow streets. His backpack bounced against his shoulders, the stolen papers rustling inside. A sharp whistle pierced the night. He's out here. Ben glanced back. Scarface had spotted him. A fresh surge of fear shot through his veins. He pushed harder, lungs burning, turning down another alley. If he could just disappear into the city. If he could find somewhere safe. Then it hit him. The news station. If no one else would listen, maybe they would. He veered left, nearly colliding with a trash can, then sprinted toward the main road. Cars zipped by, headlights flashing across his face. He dodged between them, ignoring the honks and shouts. The Channel 7 news building was just ahead. His legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. Not until he reached the glass doors and burst inside, nearly collapsing onto the front desk. A receptionist looked up, startled. "Whoa, kid? I need to talk to a reporter," Ben gasped, chest heaving. "Right now." The woman blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She sighed, already losing interest. "Then I'm sorry, but—" Ben yanked the photo from his backpack, shoving it onto the counter. "My dad said if anything happened to him, I had to take this to the police, but the police won't listen." The receptionist frowned, flipping the photo over. She read the words scrawled on the back. Her expression changed. "Wait here," she muttered, picking up the phone. Ben's heart hammered. For the first time since this nightmare started, someone was finally going to listen. Ben sat in the waiting area, his knee bouncing anxiously as he watched the receptionist whisper into the phone. The station buzzed with activity, reporters rushing past, camera crews setting up in the background, but none of it mattered. All he could focus on was the pounding in his chest, the papers crumpled in his sweaty grip, and the photo with the warning scrawled on the back. This was it. If the news station took his story seriously, if they exposed Callahan, his mom could be free. His father's secrets would finally be revealed. The door to one of the back offices swung open, and a woman stepped out. She had sharp green eyes and an air of authority. "You're the kid with the story?" she asked, studying him. Ben nodded quickly. "I have proof." She gestured for him to follow. "Come with me." Ben barely had time to step forward before the glass doors behind him slammed open. His blood ran cold. Two men in suits stormed in, Callahan's men. The taller one, broad and muscular, cracked his knuckles. Scarface, his nose still bruised from before, sneered as his gaze landed on Ben. "Time's up, kid." Ben's pulse spiked. The reporter frowned. "Excuse me, who are you?" Neither man answered. Taller one took a step forward. Ben bolted. The reporter called after him, but he didn't stop. He ran past desks, dodging startled employees. He heard the heavy thud of footsteps behind him. Scarface and his partner were close. He reached the end of the hall. A dead end. "Number no, no, no." He spun, frantically searching for another exit. The only way out. A window. It was small, but open just enough. Ben had no choice. He leapt onto the desk, grabbed the window frame, and shoved it up higher. Scarface lunged. Ben kicked backward, slamming the window shut just as Scarface's hand grabbed for him. With one last push, he forced himself through, falling hard onto the alley pavement below. Pain shot through his arm, but he didn't have time to care. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his backpack. The door to the alley burst open. Scarface was coming after him. Then, a screech of tires. A police car. Officer Daniels. He stepped out, one hand already on his holster. His gaze locked onto Ben. "You okay, kid?" Ben gasped. "They're trying to kill me." Daniels didn't hesitate. He turned to Scarface. "Hands where I can see them." Scarface hesitated for half a second, then turned and bolted back inside. Daniels didn't chase him. Instead, he grabbed his radio. "I need backup at Channel 7 News, now, and get me a warrant for Richard Callahan." Ben's chest heaved. "You believe me?" Daniels looked down at the stack of papers in Ben's hands. "This is enough to bury him," he said, flipping through the documents. His expression hardened. "Your dad was telling the truth all along." Ben swallowed, relief washing over him. It was finally over. Or so he thought. A bang split the air. A gunshot. Glass shattered. Daniels shoved Ben down just as another shot rang out. People screamed inside the news station. Ben's ears rang. His head snapped toward the street. A black car was speeding toward them. Callahan. And this time, he wasn't playing games. The gunshot still rang in Ben's ears as the black car tore down the street, tires screeching against the pavement. Officer Daniels pulled him behind the patrol car, his gun drawn, scanning for threats. But Ben wasn't looking at the gunfire. He was looking at his house. The front door was wide open, and Emma was gone. A cold wave of fear crashed over him. His little sister, alone, helpless. A phone rang inside the police car. Daniels grabbed it, listening for barely a second before his face twisted. "He has her," he muttered. Ben felt the floor drop out from under him. No. Callahan wasn't running anymore. He had Emma, and Ben knew exactly where he'd taken her. They arrived at the house in minutes, but it felt like hours. Porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. The front door stood slightly ajar, like an open invitation. Daniels signaled for backup, but Ben couldn't wait. He shoved past him, storming inside, and froze. Callahan stood in the living room, calm as ever, his suit pristine despite the chaos. Emma was in front of him, small fingers curled into tight fists, her wide eyes filled with terror. Callahan had one hand on her shoulder, the other held a gun. Ben's breath turned shallow. "Let her go," Daniels ordered, his gun trained on Callahan. Callahan tilted his head, amused. "You still think this ends with an arrest?" Daniels didn't move. Neither did Callahan. The tension thickened, pressing against the walls. Then Callahan's cold gaze landed on Ben. "You caused all of this," he said, his voice like ice. "Your father was a coward, but you forced my hand." Ben stepped forward, fists clenched. "You ruined our lives," he spat. "My dad ran because of you. My mom's in jail because of you, and now Emma—" Callahan smiled. "Families are complicated, aren't they?" Ben's stomach twisted. He wasn't just dealing with a criminal. He was dealing with a snake. Someone who enjoyed watching people crumble. But Ben wouldn't let that happen. Not this time. "You think you're in control," Ben said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "But you're not." Callahan's expression flickered. "You want to shoot me?" Ben challenged. "Go ahead. But Daniels already called for backup. This time you won't talk your way out of it." A beat of silence. Then, sirens. Loud, close. Callahan's grip on Emma tightened. His jaw twitched. For the first time he looked cornered. The sound of screeching tires outside. A rush of footsteps. The house filled with officers, guns raised. "Drop the weapon!" someone shouted. Callahan's eyes darted around, calculating, searching for a way out. There wasn't one. Slowly, he lifted his hands. The gun hit the floor with a dull clunk. Officers surged forward. Callahan barely reacted as they grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back, cuffing him. Emma stumbled forward. Ben caught her. The moment her little arms wrapped around him, he felt his whole body shake. "I was so scared," she whispered. Ben swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know." Daniel stood over Callahan, his voice hard. "This time, you're done." Callahan didn't resist, didn't fight. But just before they dragged him away, he glanced back at Ben and smiled. Like this wasn't the end. Like he still had secrets. Ben barely heard the officers talking. He barely registered the flashing lights or the voices crackling over radios. All he knew was one thing. It was finally over. Or at least, almost. There was still one thing left. His mom. They arrived at the station just before sunrise. Ben stood outside, shifting from foot to foot, his hands gripping the backpack that still held the files, the proof that had started everything. Then the doors opened. Lisa stepped out. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, her hands still trembling from the nightmare she'd been pulled into. But the moment she saw Ben, all of that disappeared. Ben. He barely had time to react before she pulled him into her arms. For the first time in weeks, he let himself breathe. Let himself believe. They were free. The news spread fast. By morning, every major channel had the same headline: corrupt businessman Richard Callahan arrested in shocking conspiracy. His crimes, his manipulation of law enforcement, his long history of making people disappear, all of it laid bare for the world to see. People in town whispered about it in coffee shops, shaking their heads. Reporters stood outside the police station, cameras flashing. The officers who had once hesitated to act were now scrambling to cover their tracks, pretending they hadn't turned a blind eye for years. But Ben didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to go home. The house felt different. It wasn't just the mess left behind from the night before, the broken lamp, the scuff marks on the floor where officers had tackled Callahan. It was something deeper, something lighter. For the first time in months, there was no weight pressing down on Ben's chest, no shadows watching from across the street, no lingering fear that one wrong step could make everything worse. Emma sat curled up on the couch, still quiet, still shaken. Their mother moved through the house like she was seeing it for the first time. Ben stood by the window, staring at the sunlight creeping in through the curtains. It was over. But then, his fingers tightened around the backpack strap. Not everything was over. Later that afternoon, Ben sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photo he had found in the storage unit. The one of his father. The one with the words scrawled on the back. "If anything happens to me, give this to the police." His dad had known he was in danger. But why? His mom sat across from him, her fingers tracing the edges of the picture. There was a sadness in her eyes, the kind that never really goes away. "He never told me," she murmured. "I knew he was hiding something, but I didn't know this." Ben swallowed. "Who's the other man in the photo?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "James Holloway." The name sent a chill through Ben's spine. He had seen it before, on one of the documents in the storage unit. "Who was he?" His mother sighed, shaking her head. "Someone your father worked for, before things got bad." Ben frowned. He pulled out his phone, typing the name into a search bar. A news article popped up. "Local business owner found dead after mysterious disappearance." Ben's blood ran cold. James Holloway had gone missing 5 years ago. A month later, his body was found in a river. And Callahan? He was never even questioned. Because he had people in his pocket. Because someone else took the fall. Ben's hands clenched into fists. His father hadn't just been running from Callahan. He had been running because he knew the truth. And now, so did Ben. That night, he stood on the porch, looking up at the sky. His mother and Emma were inside, safe. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like home again. But Ben knew this wasn't really the end. Callahan was gone. But the people who had helped him, the ones who had kept his crimes buried for years, they were still out there. His father had spent his last years trying to escape the past. Ben wasn't going to run from it. He was going to make sure it never happened again. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. A new beginning. And this time, they weren't afraid anymore. Ben's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. And just like him, we all have the power to stand up, to seek justice, and to never back down in the face of fear. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping narratives like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Hit the like button if you were on the edge of your seat and drop a comment below. What would you have done in Ben's situation? And if you think this story deserves to be heard, make sure to share it with your friends. Every like, comment, and share helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.